Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Coming to Faith Through Dawkins, 12 Essays on the Pathway from New Atheism to Christianity. Edited by Denis Alexander and Alister McGrath. Narrated by Daniel Thomas May and Siiri Scott. Preface. The title of this collection of 12 essays may require some explanation. Both editors, who have been involved in the academic field of science and religion for many decades, were somewhat surprised when we started meeting people who told us that their pathway to Christian faith began with, or was highly influenced by, the so-called New Atheists. Richard Dawkins was at the top of the list of those mentioned, but the late Christopher Hitchens also played an important role. This unexpected fact made us wonder whether there might be more people with this kind of story. A little bit of networking and browsing the web soon gave the answer. There were plenty. The personal narratives gathered here are diverse, written by those coming from very different backgrounds, from 5 different countries, but united in describing how the New Atheists played important roles in their pathways to committed Christian faith. None of our authors saw the contributions provided by the other authors until the book's publication. We can speak for all 12 of these authors in highlighting the fact that in no way should this book be seen as presenting any kind of personal attack on Richard Dawkins. Indeed, it is very much the opposite. Several authors wish to take the opportunity to thank him for playing such an important role in their search for truth. And as a popular writer on evolutionary biology, Professor Dawkins has authored books that are outstanding. Life is full of surprises, and we wonder whether these accounts might act as a stimulus to many others to reflect upon their worldviews and take time to consider where they are leading. The Editors. Introduction. The Ambiguity of Richard Dawkins. Alister McGrath. On September 11, 2001, a series of coordinated suicide attacks were launched by Islamic terrorists against targets in the United States, events now invariably referred to simply as 9/11. The Dow Jones Index slumped 7% when Wall Street reopened for business 6 days later. The war against terror became a dominant theme of the presidency of George W. Bush. Public anxiety about the deadly consequences of religious fanaticism reached new levels. Richard Dawkins had been arguing for years that religion was irrational and dangerous, without making much headway. Suddenly his arguments seemed both attractive and culturally plausible to many in Western culture. Someone or something had to be blamed for 9/11. Islamic religious fanaticism was an obvious possibility. In the white heat of anger against this outrage, Islamic religious fanaticism was simplified, first to religious fanaticism and then simply to religion. Dawkins played a central role in changing the cultural mood within Western liberal circles. 4 days after the attack, Dawkins wrote, "To fill a world with religion, or religions of the Abrahamic kind, is like littering the streets with loaded guns. Do not be surprised if they are used." Dawkins' words suggest that the events of 9/11 revealed religion to be dangerous because it is irrational. When it fails to win arguments, it resorts to terror instead. While some regarded these comments as ridiculously simplistic, others saw Dawkins as a bold thinker willing to tell the overdue truth. Religion is dangerous. It is not to be respected but to be feared, and wherever possible, neutralized. It is a time bomb waiting to explode, a loaded gun just waiting to kill people. The tragic events of 9/11 turned out to be the intellectual and moral launch pad for what is now generally known as the New Atheism, with Dawkins as its central figure. It might therefore seem strange to suggest that this same Richard Dawkins, regularly cited as the world's most famous atheist during the heyday of the New Atheism, might have caused some to rediscover religious faith and others to embrace it for the first time. So how might Dawkins have helped some find their way to faith? It is a fascinating question with multiple aspects. While the contributors to this volume each tell their own story, it is helpful to reflect on the context of this development. In what follows, I shall note 5 elements of the growing disillusionment about the new atheism that appear to be part of a shifting cultural mood, suspicious of slick certainties, aware of the need to live with a certain degree of uncertainty, and open to reconsidering religious belief. First, Dawkins' public attacks on religion, particularly Christianity, seem to have generated a surge of interest in exploring religious faith. As the sociologist Tina Beattie remarked shortly after the publication of Dawkins' The God Delusion, it seemed that Dawkins had reawakened public interest in God more effectively than any preacher could have done. This was certainly my experience. Before 2006, my own public lectures on the relation of science and faith attracted audiences in the low hundreds. For a period of more than 5 years afterward, the audience size increased dramatically, often forcing lecture organizers to turn people away. The tone of the question and answer sessions after those lectures also changed. Before the God Delusion, the questions were often academic or technical. What did I think about Albert Einstein's approach to science and religion? Was Dawkins' idea of the selfish gene helpful in illuminating the idea of original sin? From 2006 onward, questions became much more personal and existential, as audiences wanted to know how they could hold together science and religious belief. Dissatisfied with what seemed to them Dawkins' simplistic dismissal of faith, they wanted to go deeper. Many of those asking weightier questions were clearly sympathetic towards Dawkins, yet were suspicious of his aggressive rhetoric, which they suspected might mask intellectual shallowness and evidential precariousness. Second, many of Dawkins' critics since the publication of The God Delusion have been leading atheist philosophers who were alarmed at the damage they thought his shrill and superficial engagement with life's deepest questions was doing to the intellectual reputation of atheism. The British public philosopher John Gray, for example, ridiculed the banality, superficiality, and shallowness of Dawkins and his circle, who offered a tedious rerun of a Victorian squabble between science and religion. Philosophically, this amounted to little more than an outdated positivism. Culturally, it disingenuously ignored how such forms of evangelical atheism spawned violence and brutality. Gray highlights the violence of the French Revolution, the Soviet Union, and Mao's China. Evangelical atheism is the faith that mass conversion to godlessness can transform the world. This is a fantasy. If the history of the past few centuries is any guide, a godless world would be as prone to savage conflicts as the world has always been. For Gray, the crude slogans of Dawkins and other new atheists reduced atheism to a populist media phenomenon, a type of entertainment that conducted its debates through sloganeering rather than serious argument. For most philosophers, Dawkins' arguments lead only to agnosticism, not atheism, leaving Dawkins in the difficult position of being unable to prove his own core beliefs, despite demanding that his religious opponents should prove theirs. Dawkins thus uses intellectual criteria to judge his opponents' positions that he fails to apply to his own position. This epistemic asymmetry has left many potential fellow travellers feeling uneasy, wondering whether Dawkins was overlooking the vulnerability of his own position. Gray, recognizing the importance of this point, suggests that the discussion ought now to move on from a pointless discussion about whether God's existence can be disproved to the more significant exploration of why some people find that they have no use for God and are thus moved to search for God surrogates. Third, Dawkins' outlook on religion was deeply shaped by what now appears to have been an uncritical acceptance of the warfare model of the relation of science and religion, which dominated Western culture in the closing decade of the 20th century, despite growing scholarly suspicions of its evidential foundation. On the basis of his belief that there exists a total dichotomy between science and religion, Dawkins argues that a proper scientist simply cannot be religious. If science and religion are at war, then a scientist with religious beliefs is either a traitor or an appeaser. To his critics, Dawkins seems unwilling to reflect critically about his own belief system, apparently believing it to be self-evidently correct, a position often associated with religious fundamentalism. Since the 1990s, however, the historical basis of the warfare model has been dismantled within the academic community and shown to be a social construction serving the needs of certain cultural power groups, thus leaving the new atheists on the wrong side of intellectual history. This point is particularly important in that some were drawn to Dawkins because they felt his approach represented the future. They are now coming to realize it might instead represent a retreat into the socially constructed certainties of a bygone past. Fourth, the new atheism's certainties, though initially appealing to many, were soon deconstructed. This point was picked up by Gary Wolfe, the journalist who coined the term New Atheism in 2006 to designate the messianic atheism of Dawkins and his colleagues Daniel Dennett and Sam Harris, and to highlight the rhetorically aggressive means whereby they asserted their beliefs. Wolfe was struck by the trenchant certainties of these leading proponents of atheism, noting that many people found these asserted certainties to be arrogant and improbable, amounting to a significant intellectual overreach on their part. People see a contradiction in its tone of certainty. Contemptuous of the faith of others, its proponents never doubt their own belief. They are fundamentalists. Fifth, the new atheism began to show the same habits of thought and behavior that Dawkins had presented as characteristic of religious people and institutions. For P.Z. Myers, a biologist at the University of Minnesota, it was a serious error of judgment to allow Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens to assume a leadership role within the movement. How, he asked, did that happen? Within a year, a cult of personality had emerged in which Dawkins and Hitchens were turned into oracles whose dicta should not be questioned, and dissent would lead to being ostracized. Had atheism, many wondered, morphed into a new religious movement with its infallible prophets and authoritative texts, above all Dawkins and his God delusion? Perhaps it was no surprise that the movement fragmented into a shambles of alt-right memes and dishonest hucksters, mangling science to promote racism, sexism, and bloody regressive politics. Today, the new atheism, of which Dawkins was a leading representative, is generally regarded as having imploded, increasingly, though perhaps unfairly, seen as the crystallization of the cultural prejudices of old white Western males. Many of its former members, disenchanted by its arrogance, prejudice, and superficiality, have distanced themselves from the movement and its leaders. The cultural mood began to shift, as many who had initially embraced the new atheism found that it failed to deliver the secure knowledge they longed for, or a sustainable vision of the good life. The new atheism may have presented itself as an antidote to religious delusions. Its critics argue that it merely propagated a somewhat different delusion about the omnicompetence of reason and science. And, disillusioned by such spurious pseudo-certainties, many began to look for better answers, wondering if there were alternatives that might be more credible, attractive, and satisfying. As the extent of Dawkins' personal and intellectual overreach became increasingly clear, some chose to look again at the alternatives. In their own distinct ways, each of the contributors to this volume is a witness to this process of reconsideration and re-evaluation, a process that Dawkins catalyzed, though not in the way he might have wanted. In this introduction, I have outlined a context that may be helpful in understanding each of the narratives of reconsideration and reflection gathered in this volume. But what really matters are these individual stories, which need to be heard and appreciated. We begin with the scientist Cy Gard, who tells the remarkable story of how his emerging Christian faith was invigorated rather than challenged by Dawkins' God delusion. Chapter 1. A New Christian Meets New Atheism. Cy Gard. Old and New Atheism. On the first page of my recent book, The Works of His Hands, A Scientist's Journey from Atheism to Faith, I describe the worldview of my family. My parents were not the least bit religious. They were Marxists, former members of the American Communist Party, and very militant atheists. My own long journey from that beginning to Christian faith is told in the book. The culmination of that journey happened to roughly coincide with the beginning of the new atheist movement. If we define atheism as the lack of belief in God, gods, or the supernatural, or even if we define atheism as the positive belief that gods do not and cannot exist, it appears that atheist philosophy is based on one simple negative statement about reality. If things ended there, there would be little to nothing to discuss. My own original atheism, which was of the stronger version, no gods exist, was not something I spent any time thinking about, nor did I see it as an important part of my identity. I'm pretty sure that was true for the majority of atheists I knew back then. The only time our atheism ever came up was if someone said something like, "Pray with me," or "Do you believe in God?" For me, working in an academic scientific setting, this was a very rare occurrence. This is probably still true for many non-believers today, but times have changed. New atheism insists on taking atheism out of the closet and loudly proclaiming it to the world as an important and proud vision of reality. The slogan of the London atheist bus campaign, "There's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life," is one of the many examples of this new in-your-face public expression of atheism. The original four horsemen of New Atheism, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, and Daniel Dennett, made it popular to go far beyond politely declining an invitation to go to someone's church or to pray for a mutual friend. The public is exhorted to confront theists, demand rational evidence for their harmful and foolish nonsense, and proclaim the truth of atheism in the public square by publishing books, giving interviews, writing articles, and producing TV shows, films, videos, getting the word out by any and every method imaginable that gods are not real. The original four have been joined by scientists like Lawrence Krauss, Jerry Coyne, Sean Carroll, and Peter Atkins, entertainers like Penn Jillette, Bill Maher, and Ricky Gervais, and YouTubers like Aaron Ra, Seth Andrews, and a slew of others. There are now atheist conventions, atheist rallies, and many atheist organizations. At the time when this new aggressive approach to confronting Christianity burst forth on public consciousness, around 2005 to 2008, I was a new Christian, still quite private and quiet about the faith I had come to a year or two earlier. Some personal history. Before discussing how the emergence of new atheism affected my newfound faith, I need to say a bit more about my original version of atheism. My youthful worldview was what would now be called progressive. It was based on three major pillars: science as the most important but not necessarily the only proven epistemology, history as the primary method to understand the nature of humanity, and a form of liberal moral ethics that stressed human dignity and equality, the inherent rights of humankind. The value of science, history, and human dignity in understanding reality has remained the central core of my philosophical and emotional outlook to the present. But as a child, along with the importance of these three pillars, I was also learning atheistic and far-left narratives in each of these areas. I was taught that science had firmly ruled out anything supernatural or magical, and that history had illuminated the evil doings of the church and religions in general. The books I was given made it clear that religious belief had been used by rulers and owners as a tool of oppression all over the world. The issue of human dignity and freedom was cast in stark relief by the plight of the American Negro, the term used back then, as well as the historic struggle for a decent life by working people everywhere. The facts, I had learned, were clearly distorted by political and anti-religious bias. When I later read the works of the new atheists, their similarity to the legends I had absorbed as a youngster was uncanny. They were easily recognizable to me as the falsehoods I had been taught so long ago. Science and scientism. My father, a chemist, gave me an excellent introduction to science, especially the fundamental facts of physics and chemistry, as well as the basic elements of scientific thinking. He included a dire warning against scientism, the idea that science and science alone can answer all questions. While that might seem odd coming from an atheist, it has been my experience that most scientists, as opposed to atheist fans of science, also reject the notion that the scientific method is the only way to understand anything of importance in our world. As it happened, it was science, history, and liberal humanism that slowly and inexorably broke down the structural supports of my atheism and then of my agnosticism. The most important battering ram of the three was science. The more I learned about science, both in terms of methodology and the facts that research in many fields was discovering, the more I found my original deterministic and materialistic view weakening. I no longer felt that science buttressed pure atheism. It did not at all rule out the hand of some higher power. When science, a deeper study of history, and my new perspectives on human worth had left me open to hear and follow the Holy Spirit, I was blessed to be brought to a faith in Jesus Christ that was as surprising to me as it was glorious. But it was also somewhat shaky. I did not know any other scientists who were Christians. I wondered if there were any, or if I was some strange, anomalous beast who would eventually go insane from all the contradictions and cognitive dissonance. It was around this time that the new atheists burst onto the scene. Harris's The End of Faith, Dawkins's The God Delusion, and Hitchens's God is Not Great were published in quick succession. The God Delusion especially came as a tremendous blow, since Richard Dawkins had been a hero of mine for decades. I thought of Dawkins as a brilliant exponent of biological science. I still do, and I was quite gratified when he mentioned me as the discoverer of a letter from Darwin to A.R. Wallace that showed that Darwin was in fact aware of particulate inheritance. Dawkins wrote about this letter in his foreword to a new student edition of The Descent of Man, later reprinted as an essay in A Devil's Chaplain. I had found The Ancestor's Tale to be a stunning magnum opus and was still deep in admiration of the mind of this man when out of the blue, or at least for me, came The God Delusion. Later, I read Alister McGrath and Joanna Collicutt McGrath's brilliant antidote, The Dawkins Delusion, which put things right for me. Of course, The God Delusion was not, strictly speaking, that much out of the blue. The very same book that included the discussion of Darwin's letter, A Devil's Chaplain, also contained essays full of Dawkins' awakening forceful anti-theism. McGrath's response, Dawkins' God, a rebuke of the unconvincing components of Dawkins' atheism, preceded the God Delusion. What disturbed me was not so much Dawkins' strident defense of atheism, which I had only recently left behind me, but the descent in the tone and content from the brilliance of his previous works to a style that came off the pages as snarling vitriol. It was hard to believe that the same person who had written The Ancestor's Tale also wrote The God Delusion. Dawkins and Morality. Reading the God Delusions section on human morality was especially poignant for me. I started it with some trepidation that the brilliant mind of the writer would have an answer that would rock my still tender faith, but I found the opposite to be true. It was a welcome surprise. If the most scientifically based book arguing against theism could not provide any better answer to why we see good and evil in the world, then I need not worry about other potentially less weighty arguments. My faith, in fact, could grow stronger rather than weaker. Dawkins' view, of course, is that morality, just like about everything else involving life, is simply a result of evolution. He makes the case that humans do good things either as a tit-for-tat, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours kind of bargaining, reciprocal altruism, or because evolution selected for people doing good things for their kin, who carry copies of some portion of their genes, kin altruism. Dawkins then goes on to postulate what he calls misfirings of altruistic genes, by which altruistic behavior originally focused on relations and friends could be extended to all members of the species and even to other species. This, the story goes, is why people are good. And, of course, the explanation for evil is much simpler. Humans, like most mammals, do what they must to survive and help their offspring survive, even if it means being mean or cruel to others. What is interesting about this solution is that, at least for some new atheists, the morality that evolves this way is objective. Sam Harris, who holds to the same view on the evolution of human morality, frequently speaks of moral facts that are objectively true. He has claimed that certain practices like stoning women for adultery or corporal punishment of children are objectively bad based on the fact that, well, according to him, they are morally bad. But millions of people in other cultures do not agree with him, which could make a very strong argument for subjective morality. Harris says that, ironically, he gets lots of agreement from theists, many of whom also hold to a version of objective morality that comes from God and is written in our hearts and in Scripture. Of course, for Harris that is also an illusion, and the inevitable references to slavery and genocide soon follow. But what really bothered me in Dawkins' explanation was not the question of objective versus subjective morality, but the proposed mechanism, evolution. At that time, I had not done any professional research into evolutionary biology, other than how it might relate to certain aspects of cancer progression, but I had read widely on evolution, and as a molecular biologist I certainly understood the theory and its fundamental mechanisms. The almost glib assertion that people had of course evolved to be good or bad due to natural selection, much as they had evolved to see colors or to walk upright, did not make a lot of scientific sense to me. As Patrick Bateson says in his book Behavior, Development, and Evolution, the common image of a genetic blueprint for behavior fails because it is too static. Strands of DNA do not, on their own, make behavior patterns or physical attributes. Genes do not code directly for behaviors. They code for proteins. Some of these proteins are neurotransmitters, or they are part of the sensory apparatus to make up signaling pathways in brain cells. Highly complex interactions between many of these proteins can ultimately produce a combined phenotype that includes a new instinctual behavior. If that behavior, like caring for babies or appearing attractive to the opposite sex, results in some survival or reproductive advantage, evolution happens, and the genetic variant that produced the novel allele will spread through the population. But this happens over a long period of time. And that is the other problem. Human beings are a baby species, only about 200,000 to 300,000 years old. Since the dawn of Homo sapiens, there have only been a few known genetic variants that led to further evolution, and some of them are still not fixed in the human population. That is, found in everyone. These include the ability of adults to tolerate dairy products, and the ability to consume alcohol without getting sick. Milk tolerance has been slowly, from our human perspective, spreading among people for 10 to 20,000 years, but we all know people who are lactose intolerant, as we call what is in fact the original or wild-type genetic form. Those of us who can tolerate milk as adults are the mutants. So the question is, if human beings, while they were hunting and gathering, making various increasingly complex implements and eventually growing food and domesticating animals, in other words, while being human rather than being chimps or other primates, had evolved genetic variants for being good to one another, exactly what genes are we talking about? Which proteins make us nice? And which alleles of that protein make us not so nice? How do those different alleles work? And how do they spread among the population to the point where every person on the planet knows, and has known throughout recorded history at least, that there are good and bad behaviors, even if the definitions of what is good and bad differ with time and place. Recent omnigenic models, which hold that many complex phenotypes could involve hundreds or thousands of different alleles, each with a tiny effect, raise other problems. For morality to be determined by natural selection, which and how many of the multitudinous individual alleles responsible for an inherited moral genetic
Sample complete. Ready to continue?